One of the most dangerous periods of time for video games is the space between the moment you turn the game off and the point where you decide to turn the game back on again. In that gap in time, many things could happen. I'm sure most of us have put a game down either because they were done for the night or they had an obligation to fulfill, like going shopping or making dinner, only for you to come back and decide that you'd rather do something else. Maybe that something else could be watching YouTube, working on a side project, or even playing a different game altogether. This treacherous time and the danger for longevity of a video game that this time possesses cannot be understated. That is why, for me as a game designer, one way that I would love all of my games to be described is similar to how I'd want all my novels to be described, as a page turner. The need for more, the desire to see what comes next. The phrase page turner comes from the idea of neglecting sleep, from when people used to read before bed, in order to just read that one last bit of story. Now, one way to achieve this in the literary world is to have a cliffhanger every page or two. By that I mean they actually format the text and pace out the sentences on the page so that the sentences that meet the bottom right corner of the page before it turns over to the next one leads onto a big revelation that grants dopamine to the brain and makes the reader want to keep going. This is something that Stephen King accomplishes really well, especially in his book Pet Sematary. However, this doesn't necessarily translate into games well. Sometimes it does, like with the original Bioshock, which I covered in one of my first videos on the channel, but there is a massive potential to desensitize the player with this method. Every major revelation, every carrot on the stick, all take away from the next carrot to come and makes it that less sweet. So, what's the next best thing? Well, another way you can describe the strategy undertaken by Stephen King for Pet Sematary, or 2K Australia, the developers of Bioshock, is good pacing. Really good pacing, in fact. And I believe that Doom 2016 is the best video game to study when it comes to great pacing in video games without the need to make a big deal about every story beat. Doom achieves its glorious, breakneck pace in a magnitude of different ways, from the in-your-face music and fast walking speed, to some of the more subtle aspects, like the little UI tricks. So without further ado, let's analyse how Doom achieves its breakneck pace. First off, let's just say that the movement speed does have a big impact on pace. Of course it does. But everybody knows that. So instead of talking about something obvious like how insanely fast you move through the level, I'm going to cover aspects that you might not have thought about. First of which is resources. There are three types of resources in Doom. There's health, shields, and ammo. There are also three ways you can get more of these resources. One of which is more of a secondary way, is by upgrading your maximum capacity, and when you do this, much like when you upgrade your health in Skyrim, you get refilled back to full health, or ammo, or shields, depending on which one you upgrade. The other two ways are from resource packs on the ground or through killing enemies. Now, in other circumstances, resource packs being laid on the ground will be detrimental to the pacing of gameplay. Well, at least if you're aiming for fast-paced gameplay. For example, in a game like The Last of Us, where the aim is to create a slow, methodical, stealth-style gameplay, having very important resources like bullets be hidden in drawers and cupboards works well for the game, and even adds to the theme of survival. However, in Doom, these resource packs are designed to be in places where you're going to be walking over them anyway. A lot of the time, resource packs are even used to guide you through the level, which is another topic that I'm going to be getting onto in a moment. So my point is that resource packs being laid on the ground aren't detrimental to the pace, but that is due to the level design and the lack of prompts needed to pick them up. So when it comes to resources, what's the positive aspect that creates such a pace? Well, that is how the resources drop from the enemies. Not only has it become a huge trend for the main gameplay loop to be based around loot dropping from enemies, a whole subgenre has been coined, in fact, looter shooters. This genre was made to describe games like Destiny and Borderlands, but lends itself well to classics like Diablo. In short, the loot in those games are designed to cater to the desire of upgrading your character, getting better, getting stronger, and also having rare loot which you can show your friends. However, in Doom, the whole point of loot is to keep going, to keep playing, and yes, to keep up the pace. This resource mechanic balances the need for maintaining resources and in some cases strategically saving resources. For example, using the glory kill system in order to save a few shells in your shotgun, or by using your machine gun over your rocket launcher when taking down just a few stragglers. When you kill an enemy and they explode with orange loot when you are low on ammo, or explode with blue loot when you are low on health, it tells the player that yes, you can keep going at the pace you are at. Without the looting system, 1, there will be a greater likelihood of having to seek out resource packs rather than the much preferred method of just walking over them without much thought, but also it means that the chain of cool looking glory kills or switching between weapons from short range to long range to take out the last enemy from across the level is less likely to happen, just because the core gameplay loop of the game isn't facilitating that. To get the loot system right would have taken a lot of balancing. Too much loot dropping from the enemies would have caused there to be a similar desensitization process to occur to what I mentioned earlier in the video, and too little would have changed the dynamic too often from the hunter, which is when you are blowing hell monsters' heads off, to the hunted, which is when you are scrounging around for resource packs. Now, I just talked about the level design briefly there. Let's do a quick deep dive into everything that Doom does to achieve its pacing through the levels. There are 3 main important aspects that Doom levels do a really good job at. The first is visual design. In a GDC talk that I have mentioned previously in my video on how Portal makes you smarter, Dan Taylor discussed the 10 principles for good level design, one of which is using constant visual language to help guide the player.
And for a smooth and enjoyable experience, the player should always know exactly where to go, which is why it's important to develop a consistent visual language.
This is achieved in Doom with a combination of implicit storytelling visual design and also explicit in-your-face visual design. The more explicit design has almost become a copy-paste resource that many AAA games use nowadays, which is that the yellow ledge means that you can interact with it. In this case with Doom, instead of having yellow ledges, however, you have green ledges, which I think is because of how yellow the environment and sky is for a large part of Doom. But if we look at games like God of War, Uncharted, or The Last of Us, you can see a common theme of using yellow to guide the player. This is great for pacing because instead of looking around squinting for a ledge to jump on or for a wall to interact with, the player is trained from the beginning to look for the green light, which is a great effort from the level designers and by all accounts a successful way of putting a stop to looking around and being confused where to go. And also the frustration of when you miss a jump over and over again that you aren't even supposed to be trying to reach. The more implicit visual design that is used, especially at the start of the game, are blood trails and corpses. I say at the beginning because when you reach the hell levels and when you return back to Mars once you reach the hell levels, these visual cues become less and less prominent because, well, it's all blood and corpses pretty much. But when it comes to getting the player from one part of the level to the next, either through a corridor or guiding the player around large open spaces, blood trails do a great job at that. Not to mention that they also add to the implicit storytelling of the environment too, which Doom again does really well. There isn't really a corner, corridor or vent shaft without a bit of story to tell you in this game, and much like our main character, the environment doesn't use words to tell it. The other 2 ways that the level design continues to build upon the pace of the game is through the teleporters and checkpoints. The teleporters are there simply to aid the door unlocking mechanic. In both the Mars levels and the Hell levels, most areas require you to have the right access to enter smaller areas. On Mars, it's different coloured keycards, and in Hell, it's different coloured skulls. The teleporters are just there so when you find the right keys for the right doors, you don't have to backtrack your way through the entire level. And if you were to backtrack your way through the entire level, you wouldn't be partaking in the core gameplay loop of shooting monsters. Of course, you could do the Halo or Gears of War strategy of just forcing the player to go through the level backwards with more enemies spawning, but I think that specific strategy is one aspect of level design that is efficient, but very detrimental to the overall experience, and that may be another topic for a different video. And the final aspect of level design to discuss is the incredibly generous checkpoints. I have never experienced a game with such beautifully forgiving checkpoints. Fighting a boss and it has 2 phases where you die on the second one? No problem. Instead of starting from the very beginning like in Hollow Knight or Dark Souls, you instead start from the second phase. I think this is probably one of the more contentious points that I will make, but I do believe that this system suits this game better than it would a Souls game, for example, just because of what the game is trying to achieve with its pace. However, I do believe that there is an actual discussion to have about whether there is a need, other than, of course, punishment, for players to have to go through phases of boss battles they have already mastered just to have one more go at the later phases that they haven't beaten yet. Finally, let's discuss the very subtle aspects of the game, which I think add up nicely to create a larger impact on the game than the sum of their parts. Firstly, I really like how the game automatically switches weapons when you run out of ammo. This obviously keeps up the pace of the gameplay, but I just love how it feels to shoot an enemy with one weapon and finish them off with another. Truly makes you feel like a badass. On top of that, because there are 2 shotguns in the game, one single barrel and one double barrel, if you are using the double barrel shotgun and get to the point where you only have 1 shotgun shell left, whether that's because you started off with an odd number of shotgun shells or because you used a single barrel shotgun at some point, instead of switching to a random weapon or even your secondary weapon, leaving you with just 1 shotgun shell, it instead switches to the single barrel shotguns so you can always use up that last shotgun shell if you want to. I thought that was a nice touch. Next we have a couple of things which are linked to movement speed of the player, but it is more about the enemies and their AI. Firstly, the game always keeps you moving. There isn't an enemy in the game which is best defeated by standing still. This is because of 2 things. The first being that due to the combination of enemies in any given level, you often have enemies right up in your face that need to be your immediate attention, but you also have ranged enemies that are firing at you from afar. This creates a situation where even though you might not need to dodge the enemy right in front of you that very second, it is best to keep moving in case there is an enemy throwing a fireball in your direction from across the map. And that leads me on to my second point, ranged enemies, or just any enemy with a projectile. Always fire at the spot in the level that you occupied when they originally targeted you. This means that as long as you keep moving, assuming you don't have to go back to the original spot you were in, the enemy can never hit you. Of course, this gets more complicated with more ranged enemies and close quarter enemies. Like if you picture the level as a grid, the more enemies there are, especially when there are enemies that are firing at you at different times, and even more so when those enemies are enemies with weapons that fire projectiles that take a long time to get to you, there are less squares that are vacant on that hypothetical grid for you to move to. But even so, moving is always a better strategy for the player than not moving, and that of course helps keep up the pace of the game. Just imagine all of a sudden you came across clickers from The Last of Us, enemies which require you to be incredibly sneaky, quiet, and not to mention slow, as even your crawling speed is too loud for them if you're close enough. If they hear you, they will kill you with 1 attack. Imagine if they were in Doom. Another little aspect with the enemies is that the glory kills, which are the brutally animated ways to finish off the enemy you are fighting, is a great way to keep up the pace for a few reasons. 1, the animation itself is very quick. The animation is also agile so that it picks up where your camera is, how you are moving, and where you are in relation to the enemy, to create a smooth transition into the animation, which could have been disastrous if not done right. For example, imagine if the glory kills took as long as the fatalities from Mortal Kombat. Sure, the glow/gross out factor would probably work nicely with the theme, but it would take you right out of the gameplay. Some games do a really interesting job. For example, Bayonetta has a similar mechanic to glory kills in their torture attacks, which is just a small animation, but because it's third person, you're allowed to keep moving in that game. Anyway, another thing that can't be overlooked about the glory kills is the lack of punishment for using them. You are completely immune to damage when performing a glory kill, even if you have the entirety of Hell's Horde nipping at your toes. This both removes any negative effect of using the mechanic, but on top of that, bolsters the theme of badassery for pulling one off in the middle of a crowd of enemies that want to rip your arms off. Next up we have UI. The UI was one place in which this game could have failed to maintain the pace. In some cases it can have that effect, but only when it has failed in other areas. For example, a player having to use the map because of the implicit or explicit visual design in a certain part of the level wasn't strong enough. However, one major way that the UI works really well is when it comes to the weapon upgrade system. I'm going to bring up The Last of Us again because despite its very different pace, it does something very well in the crafting, and it is what Doom does when it comes to weapon upgrades. The UI shows that you can upgrade something or craft something before you go into the specific submenu. Firstly, Doom constantly reminds you that you have an upgrade token that you can use, whether it be for weapons or for your character specifically. So when you notice this as the player, you open up the menu and you can instantly see which guns you can upgrade based off how many tokens they cost and how many you have. There is also a little indicator to show when your weapons are maxed out and require challenges to further upgrade them so you don't have to bother going to that specific submenu to see if you can upgrade them. Maybe you forgot or something. I believe this is vital to making the process of the upgrade system, 1, not remove the player from the experience like Resident Evil 5 does in between missions with their upgrade system, but 2, keep up the pace and get you back to shooting hell monsters. Finally, we have the pacing of the missions. I believe that with games like this, very linear games with a set path, should properly pace out their missions to allow for players to drop in and out of their game as they please. Going back to what I said at the start of the video, if I know that I'm going to have to dedicate myself to your game for like 2 or 3 hours without being able to either save or get to a satisfying stopping point where I can easily remember what I was doing when I next pop the disc back in, then I am ever more likely to never pop it in again. Persona 5, for example, tethers this line a bit too much in my opinion. With its visual novel style of deliverance of narrative, coupled with the requirement for save rooms to save your game in specific levels, it can be really difficult to sit down and play the game when you know that you may be interrupted, or you know that you only have 30 minutes to an hour of play. Because when it comes to that time when you need to finish up, you might not be able to save for a good 20 minutes, or you might be in the middle of a dialogue with no end in sight. But with Doom, I kid you not, apart from the last mission, almost every mission for me took about 40 minutes on the dot. Obviously that can vary and probably does vary from person to person, but it was so eerily similar how the length of missions were across all 13 of them. This coupled with the generous and plentiful checkpoints that I mentioned earlier, even coupled with the implicit and explicit design making the levels easily traversable whether you have been playing for an hour or just jumped in, makes it much easier to put the controller down, knowing full well that you are going to pick it back up again. Doom isn't afraid of the time between turning the game off and back on again, because it knows that when the time comes, you will come back for more. Thank you all so much for watching. The like goal for this video is 10 likes, and if you reach it before next Sunday, then I will do a bonus stream playing through the original Doom. Make sure to hit the like button for this video, subscribe to be notified when the stream goes live, check out the links to my socials in the description, and that's about it. See you next time, guys.